This is 20 Minutes of Impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast, sponsored by Americans for a Clean Energy Grid. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. On today's podcast, my guest is Elise Caplan, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs with ACORE. Elise is going to describe ACORE's policy work on the macrogrid initiative to interconnect the nation's segmented transmission regions, which could make electricity delivery more reliable and affordable. As the key part of her over 30-year career in energy policy, Elise spent 15 years as Director of Electric Markets Analysis with the American Public Power Association. She's worked with ACORE on regulatory and policy issues since January 2022. So, Elise, what is the concept of a macrogrid? And what is ACORE's macrogrid initiative intended to do that is not possible today?
Thank you so much for having me here. Macrogrid is a really core concept to so much of the work that ACORE does. And a macrogrid broadly is an interconnected, holistically planned power grid that's enabled by high voltage transmission that can deliver significant amounts of power across regions and that both keeps electricity costs down and ensures reliability. That is not what we have today in our grid. While there have been some improvements and some increases in interregional transmission, the vast majority of new transmission built is still at lower voltages, and there are still minimal interregional projects. In fact, I just looked at FERC's most recent energy infrastructure report, and it shows that through September of this year, only 2 miles of 500 kV or higher transmission came online. So that's a real
2 miles.
disappointment. Yeah,
Oh, yeah, that's
1.8.
amazing. 2 miles. Um, but I want to ask you something. First of all, FERC, at Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, for anybody that's listening and doesn't know that, um, you you said holistically planned. So we have all kinds of parts to a national grid, but there's no planning that goes into it. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, we did have the very important order from FERC, Order 1920, which greatly improved the regional transmission planning that is done by all of the planning regions across the country. Order 1920 did include some limited interregional coordination provisions. It did require transmission providers to share information and jointly evaluate interregional transmission that may address some of the needs found, but there really is not any kind of comprehensive requirement for interregional planning, for common best practices, methodologies. So we really don't see it done as much as we should. And ACORE and many others have been advocating at FERC for many years to follow 1920 with a comprehensive interregional transmission planning rule as well as other policies.
Yeah. Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about 1920 in a little while, but
Yep.
so in other words, you call it a macrogrid initiative because it
Mhm.
comes with uh, efforts to buoy up
Yes.
things like planning. Is that what you're saying when you say it
Yeah.
should be holistically planned?
Yes, absolutely. Well, ACORE established the Macrogrid Initiative, or I can call it MGI, to provide information and education and conduct analyses that really elevate the economic and reliability benefits of interregional transmission
Ah,
that can be fed into decision makers and the public. I can give you an example of some of the analyses that have been commissioned under MGI. We've put out a few analyses by Grid Strategies that demonstrated the high value that additional interregional transmission would have had it been in place during winter storms Elliott and Uri. For example, the MGI report showed that during Winter Storm Uri, an additional gigawatt could have saved nearly $1 billion and kept the heat on for 200,000 Texas residents during that storm. And so one could even argue that an interregional transmission would save lives. So MGI is very much an educational effort, but these type of analyses and education are really important in directly informing policymaking. And as the ACORE resident FERC nerd, I use a lot of the MGI studies when I'm filing comments that will inform FERC on their actions.
well, that's what I want to ask you about next now, but I just want to clarify. So, what you're saying is that Texas is a separate interconnection area
Yeah.
from the rest of the country. Winter Storm Uri, of course, was a severe impact in Texas. Lives were lost. But one of the interesting things about the Texas system is that it's not very well interconnected. So what you're getting at in that particular example of a cost and benefit issue is that had Texas been interconnected to the eastern part of the country or the western part of the country, a lot of the most severe impacts of Uri probably would have been could have been allayed. That's what you're saying? I think is
Yes.
that correct?
Yes, and that type of analysis that we did is just a great demonstration of the direct benefits from a more interconnected grid. Texas is a very extreme example, as you point out, because it does not have many interconnections to the eastern and western interconnections.
So let's talk about costs and benefits, and I also want to talk about barriers in this part of the conversation. But first, costs and benefits. Building, planning, and building an interconnected system is going to take a lot of investment. Is it worth it? Do you have studies that show it's worth it?
No, absolutely, absolutely. There are multiple studies that show that transmission yields net benefits. That means that over time, as you account for all of the capital costs in building and maintaining the lines, you're still going to reap net benefits. And in fact, to go back to 1920 for a minute, if you read the introduction to Order 1920, that is one of the key things that FERC talks about, is that this order will save money. And that is even more dramatic on an interregional basis. And basically, it's very logical. When you have long range transmission, you're accessing a whole diversity of resources. That means if there is more wind available in one region and high demand in another region, you can connect those two. If you have natural gas constraints in one region, then you can access natural gas that is not constrained, that's powering generators in another region. So it cuts across generation types. It also accesses variations in demand. One of the biggest use cases for interregional transmission is when you have extreme weather. So you may have an area where you're suddenly having extremely high demand, and another region isn't facing that same level of weather intensity. So you can bring power from that region to another. So it's a much more optimized grid. It's a much more efficient grid. And if you look at the seven categories of benefits in 1920, two of the big ones are that you would save energy costs, but also you would actually avoid building generation. There's a capacity cost savings because you are accessing the diversity of resources and the diversity of demand across the grid. So the benefits are really high. There's been a lot of studies of this.
Yeah.
So, for example, I would just note that Southwest Power Pool, most recent integrated transmission plan, their benefit ratios go up to 18 to 1. And they're using a lot of 765 kV in that plan. So that's really dramatic, but in a lot of ways, not surprising.
Is that just for the Southwest Power Pool
That's their
region?
regional transmission plan. That's what they
Okay.
found.
Um, and so what you're saying is it could be a $18 benefit for every dollar
Yep.
spent in building high voltage transmission.
Yeah.
That's what you're essentially saying, right?
That's what SPP has found in their analysis. Yes.
Okay. And as you say, there's a lot of other estimates of the costs and benefits.
Yeah.
I would imagine the costs and benefits change depending on what region you're in, right?
It could change in terms of the specifics by what region you're in because there's a lot of factors that go into play and also how you're modeling it can change. But across the board, interregional transmission that is well planned would actually bring pretty significant benefits. The Department of Energy in 2024 did a very, very detailed transmission planning study. It was a very detailed modeling exercise, and they modeled a grid with significantly expanded both AC and HVDC transmission across the regions. And they found anywhere from 270 to 490 billion through 2050. Mostly through enabling access to lower cost generation resources and
So
also
that's the amount of benefits that those that
yes,
okay.
yes, yes. And that was a very elaborate modeling exercise, very detailed. Obviously, they're going to do multiple scenarios, so you're going to get a range of benefits. But that was an example of the type of analysis and what
And
it
so
can produce.
just to clarify, said those numbers again, the benefits and then against what cost?
So I believe those are net savings of 270 to
Oh, net
490
savings.
billion. Yeah.
Ah, okay. Interesting. Well, so obviously there's an enormous potential for value in doing this and interconnecting these what we have now, this balkanized system that we have now. But so why haven't we done it? I mean, that's the next question. What are the barriers that have stopped us?
Yeah, and there's a lot of observations of this. So it's not just one factor, there's multiple factors. I already noted that there's not any kind of holistic interregional transmission planning requirement or consistent methodological approaches. We don't always see a multi-value analysis of transmission, which really recognizes these benefits. There's also permitting. We need multiple states to improve an interregional line. And that's the reason that one reason why we do have provisions for FERC to use backstop siting authority in the event there's an identified national interest transmission line and states are rejecting it or not acting on it or don't have the authority. That's a very complicated process. You need the Department of Energy to identify a national interest electric transmission corridor and then FERC to identify the line, and you can have double environmental permitting requirements under the National Environmental Protection Act. So there's a lot of complexity in that. There's also, if you're building lines that are subject to federal permitting delays, federal permitting, there can be delays in the environmental studies, there can be litigation. There's also, and we could talk about this more, there's a lot of controversy over the cost allocation, and I think there's a lot of misunderstanding that the cost can only be allocated to a demonstrated beneficiary under FERC policy. And there's not a full appreciation of what we just talked about, which is how significant the net benefits can be. So that can be controversial. For some of the longer lines, like the high voltage direct current lines, a lot of those are built by independent or what are called merchant developers, and they may have more uncertainty around cost recovery. There's actually proposals into FERC to do a technical conference to look at the compensation for independent developers of HVDC lines. And that's something that was dealt with in the Energy Permitting Reform Act, which we can talk about. But that is also another factor. So you have a really multiple different factors coming into play that are barriers.
How do you, I haven't really come down to this basic question. How do, how do you resolve all that? Is that part of why you call it the macrogrid initiative? Because it takes enormous amount of initiative to deal with all those issues.
Yeah, that's a good question. We could phrase it as the macro grid initiative, right? It is the macro grid initiative because of the vision and the importance of a macro grid. However, we do have our work cut out for us, and we have been doing a large amount of work. So the work does involve, like I mentioned, the analyses and the studies, but a lot of our work also in actively participating at FERC. ACORE is very involved in all of the information gathering and rulemaking and technical conference proceedings. FERC is an extremely important agency and they've done some great work. There's a lot more work to do. So some of the effort is analysis and research and then ongoing participation and conversations and working with other allies on this. So fortunately, there is a lot of interest from a lot of organizations right now in the value of an expanded transmission grid. So if you look at any FERC proceeding that involves transmission, you will see hundreds and hundreds of comments really stressing that importance. And now that we have projections of significant demand growth, not just from data centers, but also onshoring of manufacturing and electrification of buildings and vehicles, the interest in expanded transmission and ensuring affordability of energy while we meet this really important demand growth just makes even more of a case for a macro grid.
When you come down to it, many of the barriers you described have to do with conflicts between interests. And as you say, this demand growth that we're facing right now is starting to align
Yeah.
opposition in to it favoring. And along those lines, I want to ask you next a two-part question. Parts are related. First, what recent technologies make building a macrogrid more practical today? And second, what political strategies are you working on? Will you be able to save this deal on the SPEED Act that has the siting and permitting reforms that could make this happen? What if you don't, or if you can't, what reforms are going to be most important going forward? In general, what I'm asking is this technologies and then what's on your legislative macrogrid initiative to-do list.
Yeah, sure. So I'd love to talk about the technologies. That is something we have also been very involved in and supportive of. So really the way we see it is it's a dual imperative. We do need to expand the grid, but while we're expanding the grid, we need to also both improve and modernize the grid that exists. And while we're expanding the grid, making sure that we are using the latest and greatest technologies. So there are several key technology categories. One is the suite of grid enhancing technologies. Many people are familiar with these. I'm happy to talk about them in more detail, but these include dynamic line ratings, advanced power flow controls, and topology optimizations. And all of these are the most near-term technologies you can put on the grid. A lot of them are software programs. They can be added to the existing grid, and they can greatly expand the capacity of the grid. They are well demonstrated to save money. They really are no-brainers. They are
Right, they're
a
already
lot
being
of
used.
brains went into developing them, but the decision to use them is very clear. Next, you
Absolutely.
have the family of high performance conductors, and those include both advanced conductors like the carbon core conductors, as well as the superconductors, and those can, at a minimum, increase capacity 2 times the existing capacity. They can also reduce losses. They have benefits for wildfire mitigation. So those can be put in with either reconductoring an existing line or incorporated into any new line that's built. The other technology for the longer distance lines is the high voltage direct current transmission, which also can be a significant cost saver and very efficient. And like I noted, there's limited HVDC being built right now. We see a lot more HVDC in Europe, for example, and even China. We'd like to see that expanded here. So through the Macrogrid Initiative and all of ACORE's work, we are advocating for all of these technologies to be adopted at a much greater level along with the needed grid expansion. So I wanted to
Before
note
you
all that.
before you move to political strategies, Elise, I just want to point out what you're saying, and I phrased the question very specifically. These are all things that are available today
Yes.
that weren't really fully available in over the long term that people have been pointing out the need to interconnect the balkanized transmission system that we have. Now we have these technologies. That's one of the most important things I think that you're saying and that I'd like to emphasize, right? These things are now available that have changed the idea of a macrogrid from concept to something we should do right now.
Well, I would say that, well, a lot of these technologies have actually been around for a while, so they're very well proven. They have not gotten sufficient attention. There is increasing interest in them. We're seeing a lot of states, for example, adopting legislation, passing legislation to promote grid enhancing technologies and high performance conductors. What they do is that we've always needed this macro grid. We need it now more than ever. But if we can both pursue a macrogrid and adopt these technologies, it's even more affordable. We will get more out of the grid by incorporating these technologies into its expansion.
Okay, political strategies. What are we going to do about the SPEED Act that has permitting and siting reforms?
Yeah, so to step back, I note ACORE is not a lobbying organization, so we do put forth a lot of information. We can broadly comment on legislation, so we did have broadly supportive statements. We have put out a detailed list of our priorities for permitting legislation, so I will walk through those. But I would first note what I said earlier. As a very broad, one can think of a political strategy is to constantly be communicating the importance of transmission, the importance of permitting reform, make sure that it is well recognized that both permitting reform and transmission are essential to the economy, essential for reliability, essential for the expansion of AI, and that there's really across the board benefits from all of that. So that one may think of as political, but that really is getting that information, getting those benefits out there. So we do have a lot of materials on that. There is a lot of interest in both permitting reform and transmission expansion. So maybe I could talk a little bit more about our priorities on
Good.
what we saw with SPEED Act. I also mentioned the Energy Permitting Reform Act last year that did not pass the Senate, did pass through Energy and Natural Resources. So I would say in terms of legislation, one could even think of it as four buckets. We used to have three buckets. Another one's been added, which I will explain. And three of
Ah,
these were initially addressed in speed to some degree. So these are NEPA permitting efficiencies, these broad permitting efficiencies, greater use of, say, categorical exclusions, more timelines to be adhered to before and after the environmental studies, increasing staff resources. Those are all important. Then there's having some reasonable timelines around the judicial review. So having a limitation of when a party can bring a suit, for example. Then another bucket is what we saw added on to EPRA, which is specific transmission focused provisions requiring interregional planning rules from FERC, making sure that all transmission providers, including independent transmission providers, can go to FERC for cost recovery and cost allocation, streamlining the use of FERC's backstop siting authority. Those are some of the transmission provisions. The fourth bucket is something we didn't have last year that is new to this year, which is the absolute need for permitting certainty and also removal of discriminatory permitting provisions. There was a lot of debate on this in speed leading up to its final passage. So this would cover the language that was added to speed initially to make sure that an agency could not go back and stop work on an already permitted project or revoke a permit unless you have some extreme mitigating circumstances. Then there was language added on top of that to speed that would exempt any actions taken from January 2025 through enactment of speed, including those are initiated. And then we saw the highly problematic stop work orders on offshore wind. So that would not be covered by speed because of this grandfathering, and that really derailed a lot of the very productive permitting discussions, especially in the Senate, where we know that Republicans and Democrats were working together and making progress on improving speed and also adding transmission provisions. So that was a real disappointment. We will continue to push on the benefits of permitting, the benefits of the transmission provisions, and the real need to prevent these stop work orders. And then the second category of concerns is some of the discriminatory permitting policies that were put in place, for example, by the Department of Interior. We would like to see that addressed in legislation as well. So unfortunately, we had three buckets, and now we have a fourth super important bucket on permitting certainty.
you're reminding me of an old Hank Williams song called "My Bucket's Got a Hole in It." Um, I it really, I don't want to put you on the spot. I want to tell our listeners we're recording on January 13th, and I'm putting you on the spot, but I'm encouraging you to say you don't know or you don't want to answer if you want to. The question really on all our minds is there going to be a way to reconcile this big controversy over that fourth bucket being in the bill, or is this going to be another effort at permitting and siting reform that falls by the way? Do you have an opinion on that?
I wish I knew what was going to happen. So I would fall back on the cautiously optimistic phrase, given the multiple interest in permitting certainty, and that applies to all resources, but I cannot predict what is going to happen, unfortunately. I'd be very wealthy
Okay.
if I could.
If you want to hear the big last exchange of this terrific conversation, support the podcast by subscribing at just $2.99 per month to the Power Sector Podcast's Power More. With your subscription, you'll get both parts of the content delivered directly to you the second they drop.